Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, I am happy to welcome you to yet another session of the NPTEL course, The History of English Language and Literature. Today's lecture is based on modernist poetry. It's also important to state right at the outset that we shall not be able to take a very detailed look at individual poets and individual works. But since the modernist period itself is a very complex and a complicated phase, we shall be taking a look at modernist poetry in general, trying to locate the major aspects of it and also identifying the major influences that shaped perhaps the most representative poets of the period. Having given a very detailed introduction to the modernist period and also having shown the various forces which were at work when the modernist literary period had begun, we try to look at the general features of poetry, and also at the outset we shall also be giving this a caveat that it's impossible perhaps to give a very linear discussion of modernist poetry. In that sense, we shall be talking about some of the shifting tendencies in a way that one overlaps with the other, but nevertheless a holistic and a comprehensive attempt is being made here in the form of a short lecture. We had already taken a look at the Edwardian and the Georgian period and also had underlined that the world wars had played a very important role in shaping the modernist sensibilities. Let's take a look at one of the statements made by a major poet of the early 20th century, Wilfred Owen, who's also classified as one of the war poets. He wrote like this in his preface to poems: "I am not concerned with poetry. My subject is war and the pity of war. The poetry is in the pity. Yet these elegies are to this generation in no sense conciliatory. They may be to the next. All a poet can do is warn. That's why the true poets must be truthful." Here we get a very different sense of poetry, a kind of poetry that is not about poetry itself but more about the socio-political sensibilities of the period. So now we begin to look at what actually characterized the First World War poetry. The characteristic response to war until the World War was that war was a matter of duty. We do find this getting explicated in Robert Brooks' poem The Soldier, which we had taken a look at in the previous session. Brooks' attitude to war was that of a very conventional and romantic one, and he also had very deep patriotic feelings in place. But the horrors of the First World War and whatever that followed, it in fact had marked the end of a phase of a European liberal culture. This also had led to a massive loss of lives, which also had shocked the entire humanity in the early 20th century. If we go by what historians say, over 9 million lives were lost from Europe, the British Commonwealth and the USA. And this also had inflicted deep psychological wounds and a sense of desolation across the world. And we also find that it was getting more and more difficult, not just for the English people, but for anyone who was involved with this horrors of war, to continue to believe in the values expressed in Brooks' poem, The Soldier. So the war poets and their writings could be seen as a reaction to this conventional understanding of war and to the realization that war is no longer a solution to any of the problems that the modern world was facing. One of the important poets of this period, Sigfrid Sassoon, he criticized war vehemently. In his poems Counterattack and They, we find him talking about useless suffering, rejection of notions of glory and heroism, and also a moving away from the glorification of patriotism. Edmund Blunden's memoir, The Undertones of War, talks about war as something that destroys nature, and we also find him being very anguished with the memories of his dead comrades. In the war poetry, the dead soldiers are not seen merely as heroes, but they are seen as losers and victims, contrary to the popular patriotic understanding. In one of his poems, 1916, Scene from 1921, he exactly depicts all the horrors that were inflicted upon not just the soldiers but also on their extended families and also the society in general. Edward Thomas and Isaac Rosenberg also wrote about the various casualties of war, And it was not just that they were all writing about the casualties of war. The war poets themselves had, in fact, died in these wars. And Wilfred Owen, perhaps the most known and the most anthologized of these war poets, he was killed in the First World War. It was considered as an eye-opener, and many others continued to expose the vainglory associated with the overglorification of war. In fact, in Owen's poems and writings in general, we find that he believed that no cause justifies the loss of a life on such a colossal scale, and many did agree with him. And some of his works, Anthem for Doomed Youth and In a Strange Meeting and Disabled, in these poems there are no heroes. In fact, he only talks about maimed characters coping with physical disability and also horrific memories. In fact, there is no room for patriotism or nationalism when one is affected with this sort of tragedy in life, and this also leads him to question, was there ever an enemy? There were also these women poets, Madeline Ida Bedford, Eva Dobell and Jessie Pope, who wrote about the horrors and also about the vain glories of war. In terms of poetry, A. E. Housman's A Shropshire Lad, published in 1896, deserves a very special mention. It was a compilation of 63 poems. In fact, it was said that this was a volume that most of the soldiers in the trenches in the First World War carried with them, because the poems largely spoke about love and loss, the English countryside and seasons, the passing of time and death, and also about reflections about a lost love. And these were the things that the soldiers perhaps loved to read and talk more about when they were leading such a tragic life within the trenches. And A. Housman's A Shropshire Lad also holds a very unusual distinction for a collection of poetry. It's a volume that has never been out of print. And some of his poems are immensely popular even today. And one goes like this: because I liked you better than suits a man to say. It irked you, and I promised to throw the thought away. A famous poem of his, which continues to be anthologized and widely read, is Terence, This is Stupid Stuff. It goes like this: Terence, this is stupid stuff. You eat your victuals fast enough. There can't be much amiss, 'tis clear. To see the rate you drink your beer, but oh good Lord, the worse you make, it gives a chap the belly ache. The cow, the old cow, she's dead. It sleeps well, the horn head. We poor lads, 'tis our turn now to hear such tunes as Kill the Cow. Pretty friendship, 'tis to rhyme, your friends to death before their time, moping melancholy mad. Come, pipe a tune to dance to, lad. So he did write such a very humorous verse, which also lightened the mood perhaps during the war-torn phrase. Let's now take a look at some of the very important movements of this period which influenced poetry, art and the general cultural temperament in England. Imagism was one of the foremost movements of this kind. In fact, this was a movement in art which emphasized a form above everything else. In fact, it also called for the removal of the poet from the poem and also a heightened sense of objectivity. The poet, who was following an imagist mode, he or she did not focus on any extra ornamentation or abstractions. In fact, the words were to convey accurate and precise meanings and no more or no less. There was this imagist manifesto which also celebrated a hard and clear picture of art and literature. And they also privileged clarity of expression through use of precise visual images more than anything else. And also some of them believed that the intention was to capture emotions and events in an instant of time. Some of the practitioners of this imagist school of poetry were Ezra Pound, T. Hume, E. A. Robinson, Ford Madox Ford, Amy Lowell, and Hilda Doolittle, also known as H.D., and F.S. Flint, and they were the ones who formulated the aesthetic of this predominantly art movement. There's also a literary rumor that Pound is said to have invented imagism to launch Hilda Doolittle's career in 1912. Shortly take a look at how Pound was influential in shaping and reshaping the career moves of most of the writers of the early 20th century. Pound himself edited a volume, Des Images, in 1914. And though this did have a lot of followers in the early 20th century, it was considered as a very short-lived movement. And this movement was primarily designed in the early 20th century to replace the soft voice of Victorian verse and also go nearer the bone. And among the chief contributors and the chief practitioners of imagist poetry include James Joyce and D.H. Lawrence. But however, there are people like D.H. Lawrence whose poetry could be considered images, but they were not really associated with the movement. So in that sense, we do find a lot of ways in which the beginning of the 20th century and the beginning of modernism begins on a very complex note, because it becomes very difficult to identify particular poets with particular kinds of movements. There are a lot of overlaps and also radical departures that characterize their work as well as their general lifestyle. The other images poets were Norman Cameron, David Gascoigne and Charlotte Mew. And Charlotte Mew in fact continues to be mentioned as one of the significant women poets of the early modernist period. Futurism was another movement which laid the foundations of modernist poetry. The Futurist Manifesto was published in 1909 and with a different edition in 1912 by F.T. Marinetti. This sort of a move was towards an emphasis on vibrant energy, and it also celebrated the beauty of speed, keeping in tune with the fast industrialized pace in which England and Europe in general were moving ahead. And this sort of poetry, written with a futurist manifesto, it sought a more dynamic language and expression. And we also find accordingly the poetry getting characterized by extreme energy, violent and vivid imagery, and also descriptions of movement and action. We also find these sort of poetry and poets celebrating technology and also glorifying war and violence, quite in contrast to the war poets of the early period. And we also find that the integral elements and the integral motives in these works are automobiles, speed and movement, which also was a way in which the modernist period was getting manifested itself. Vorticism was another movement in art and literature. It was in fact a movement which involved a higher degree of abstraction influenced by both the futurists and the cubists. It was mostly confined to England, and these set of poets also showed a fascination with technology, energy, and also attempts were being made to relate art with industrialization. This movement was particularly influential in poetry, painting and sculpture. As Ezra Pound would put it, the image was a vortex through which ideas rush through. So the visual element, which was getting all the more important in the modernist phase, was coming through most of these movements and most of the works of those times. Wyndham Lewis, who was a writer, painter and publisher of the modernist times, is perhaps the most important practitioner of vorticism. He used a lot of color and swirling patterns and images of violent movement and energy in his works. In fact, Journal of those times, Blast, which was jointly published by Pound and Wyndham Lewis, it did celebrate a vorticist movement to a great extent. In its inaugural issue, Blast did speak about the living plastic geometry, which was also an extension of the movement of vorticism. Blast, though it ran only for about a few issues, it was immensely popular. It continues to be referred as a modernist manifesto and also as a matter of historical interest. Surrealism was another movement which was characterized mostly in the visual arts than in poetry. And Salvador Dali was perhaps the most important practitioner and proponent of surrealist art. Surrealist Manifesto, published by Andre Burton in 1924, had laid the foundation to this. And in this movement, we find the use of unconscious as the source of creative energy. And the artists also use of weird combinations, non-linear and random sequences, as we can see in this very famous painting by Dali, titled The Persistence of Memory. And here we find that there is a lot of use of abstractions and also weird kind of combinations which are being used. The other literary practitioners include Dylan Thomas, James Joyce, Gascoigne and Martin Amis. So altogether we can find that a lot of movements and a lot of forces were coming together to produce what is generally and loosely known as modernist poetry. So taking a look at particular kinds of writings and particular writers, we shall begin with Ezra Pound, who lived from 1885 till 1972. He was born in USA and moved to Britain and Europe at a later point, and his reputation chiefly rests in the very difficult verse that he produced during his lifetime, and he is reputed accordingly as one of the most difficult poets of the 20th century. He is also said to have launched the writing careers of several modernist writers, and in fact he was at the forefront of vorticism and imagism, and it's very difficult to say whether his poetry belonged to one kind or the other. He was very instrumental in shaping the writing and also the career of Eliot, Joyce, Frost and Hemingway. And as we mentioned earlier, he's also said to have launched Hilda Doolittle's poetic career. But he did have a controversial side to his life. He supported Mussolini during the Second World War and accordingly got arrested in 1945 by the American forces. He was, however, declared insane after the trial, but he was released only by 1958, which also meant that he had to spend a considerable amount of time in prison, and he then returned to Italy, where he spent the rest of his life. In fact, his reputation had declined considerably during this period due to his political choices and the trial and the prison period that he had undergone. And in Times magazine, which came out in 1933, there was this particular comment about Pound, that he was a cat that walks by himself, tenaciously unhousebroken and very unsafe for children. Some of his important works include a Repose and a Cathay, which was a translation, a set of essays, Make It New, and also a long series of poems, which is also considered as one of his best works, the Cantos. When we talk about Pound's modernism, it would be impossible not to talk about the translations and the adaptations that he had carried out. In fact, his interest was very varied. His range was from the Old English writers till some of the 20th century Chinese poets. And this also made his poetry extremely inaccessible because most of the material that he accessed was very esoteric and also not very known to everyone. And we find him assimilating the ancients and also the non-European cultures in English poetry. This was indeed an interesting thing, but it also made it very difficult to access his poetry without a reference source. Eliot makes this comment about Pound. He was objectionably modern and objectionably antiquarian. So it's very difficult to locate and identify the source of his poetic genius. Pound was also a poet who had given adequate attention to form. In fact, he was an advocate of spare imagery and free verse, as we can see in a poem In a Station of the Metro. In fact, this poem written in 1913, it only has about 24 words. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. The entire poem is comprised of these 14 words. But in Cantos, we find a very prolific poet at work. It had about 120 sections and it could be considered as a multicultural epic. It included almost everything under the sun, such as Chinese characters, quotations in European languages, references from African history. But however, Pound never bothered to explicate his references. And this also led to him composing a lot of unconnected sections and a fragmented imagery. It nevertheless made the reception of the work all the more difficult. It continues to be one of the most difficult texts to access. Said that this work, Cantos, also has a lot of autobiographical elements built into it. And keeping in tune with the times, he also had a major fascination for economics, and we find banking occupying a key thematic interest in his writings. In fact, Hemingway had opined about Pound's work. The best of Pound's writing, and it is in the Cantos, will last as long as there is any literature. So that was a kind of impact that Pound had left in the modernist period. Now we take a look at the event known as the Irish Literary Revival. It was nothing but an upsurge in interest in Celtic myths and legends, particularly in Ireland's Gaelic heritage. This was also nicknamed as Celtic Twilight, based on a poem by Yeats published in 1893. But however, this was seen more as a renaissance than as a decline, and this movement was centered in Dublin and also in London. This was quite similar to the sentimental Scottish Kiliat school, and however, on the contrary, the interest and the concern was more with national identity and cultural individuality. This period was the struggle for Irish nationhood. It also saw an increased and heightened sense of Irish national consciousness. So some of the important publications of this time include the Gaelic Journal, which was exclusively devoted to the preservation and cultivation of the Irish language. And we also find the Irish Literary Society being founded in 1892, with some of the major important writers being a part of this. William Butler Yeats was perhaps the most important and the most noted figure of the Irish literary revival. He lived from 1865 till 1939. His work, in fact, stretches across the late Victorian period towards the early modernism. In that sense, we can find in his work more marked changes than that could be found in Thomas Hardy's. And he was quite different from many of his contemporaries. And in his work, we do find that he was not as restlessly experimental as Eliot, nor was he as content as Hardy. However, in terms of his poetic genius, he is considered as the greatest modern poet of Ireland. His first poetry was published in 1885, and he also went on to win the Nobel Prize in 1923. He was immensely influenced by the French symbolists, but however, his ambivalent attitude towards Ireland's struggle had made him a little unpopular for a while. In fact, Maud Gonne, on whom he also had some romantic interest for a while, she viewed Yeats as being insufficiently radical in his nationalism. It was in his poem Easter 1916 that we find a certain kind of a transformation that Yeats underwent. And in fact, he talks about the transformation of Ireland as well as the changes that had come about in his view of the relationship with Maud Gonne. And this poem Easter 1916 was immensely popular and immensely important in the social history of Ireland as well, because it did talk about the Easter rising that happened in 1916. It was also a very important part of the Irish struggle for independence. And in his poem Meditations in the Times of Civil War, Yeats mocks himself for his indifference, because he was quite aware of the way of his own limitations, and also about the way in which he could not commit himself radically to the cause of Irish nationalism. Yeats' poetic experiments could be considered very interesting. He was interested in mysticism and also practiced something that he called as automatic writing, that is, writing in a trance. And he also tried to develop a feminine persona through his writing, because he tried to compose a two-voiced poetry which included both feminine and masculine elements. And he believed that he wanted to explore his own fragmented personality through his poetry, because according to him, mind was not just male or female, but a bit of both. And in this arguments, we can also find a very profound influence of Freud's theory. And his love poems, such as Leda and the Swan, they were considered deeply erotic and violent. They were also considered as quite objectionable by some of the writers of those times. And in his works such as Sailing to Byzantium, we also find an anxiety about body, mortality and death, which also exemplified many of the struggles and many of the fears that the modernist mind had. His work Second Coming is perhaps the best known poem and the best conceived poem of Yeats. In this, we find him articulating the vision of civilization and destruction, and also he talks about Christianity's peak and destruction after 2000 years. And he also composed two poems known as the Byzantium poems, Lapis Lazuli and the Tower. And throughout his work, we can identify three different stages in Yeats' poetry. The first was when he was associated with the aesthetic movement of the 1890s and the Celtic Twilight. And the second one was dominated by his commitment to Irish nationalism. And the third one was a fusion of both periods. While the first phase was mostly private, the second was mostly public. In the third period, we find him becoming less public and more personal. And he also began to celebrate the eternity of art in his works. In fact, when we talk about his poetry and compare it with Eliot, the another important stalwart of this period, we can find that Yeats adheres strictly to traditional forms than Eliot. In fact, he is more comfortable with direct expression of a personal self. In his work, we notice a less ironic tone, but also he is less distrustful of romanticism than Eliot. In fact, overall, we also find that Yeats is less willing than Eliot to embrace a single religious vision. Overall, in the modernist period, characterized by the various complex forces at work, we also find these writers trying to compose radically different poetry from one another. Thomas Stearns Eliot, who lived from 1888 until 1965, could be considered as the representative poet of the modernist period. He was one writer who moved from USA to England in 1914, and he also renounced his American citizenship by the time he turned 39 years old. He also went on to win the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1948. Though he lived during the war-torn period, his poetry has got very little direct reference to war. But however, he talks about a wasteland in his poem with the same title, and he talks about a land which is laid waste by war, though there are no direct references to the First World War. In fact, he believed that war had led to a spiritual and cultural ruin of the entire humanity. And in this poem, in one of the sections, he talks about these fragments I have showed against my ruins. So the specific reference is not there, but however, one do find that the war had attacked not just the physical spaces, but also the general spirituality and also the cultural artifacts of those times. In his poetry, we do find a radical break from the past, but critics are also of the opinion that he had to be radically different because one had to change the poetic idiom which was already exhausted. And he also practiced a free verse in poetry and did not subscribe to any rigidities. And he also had based his work on three principal qualities. The first one was his particular sense of the age in which he lived. The second one was that in his poetry, he used the poet's emotions as a starting point. And in that sense, he also developed this theory of impersonality. In that sense, he also developed the theory of impersonality through his poetry, which also became the basis of most of his works. The third was that he used quotations from and allusions to other works, and leading to a sense of continuing intertextual communication and community in all his works. Quoting him from his critical work Sacred Wood, immature poets imitate, mature poets steal, bad poets deface what they take, and good poets make it into something better, or at least something different. We find that in Eliot's poetry, he continues the tradition of dramatic monologue and also exploits the past for the use in the present. He also considered himself thoroughly English, though he was immensely influenced by a lot of European traditions. He also practiced the stream of consciousness technique in his work The Love Song of Alfred J. Prufrock, and in his later poetry, we also find him searching for spiritual peace. For instance, The Journey of the Magi is a supreme example of this. But however, his reputation was also clouded by a lot of charges of anti-Semitism, and as one of the historians note, Eliot's conservative religious and political convictions began to seem less congenial to the post-war world. Other readers reacted with suspicion to his assertions of authority, obvious in four quartets and implicit in the earlier poetry. The result, fueled by intermittent discovery of Eliot's occasional anti-Semitic rhetoric, has been a progressive downward revision of his once towering reputation. But nevertheless, its influence on literary history continues to be quite immense. He was also the modernist writer who revived the critical interest in metaphysical poetry through his work in 1921. He also had included a lot of shocking and bewildering images in his poetry. In fact, he believed that the reader had to rebuild the fragments by an indirect process of association, which he identified as objective correlative. To give his own definition, the only way of expressing emotion in the form of art is by finding an objective correlative. In other words, a set of objects, a situation, a chain of events which shall be the formula for that particular emotion, such that when the external facts which must terminate in a sensory experience are given, the emotion is immediately revoked. And a few others also were quite instrumental in shaping his poetic career, such as Charles Baudelaire and also Dante, who was a historical inspiration for most of his poetry. Eliot also had composed a few plays such as Murder in the Cathedral, The Cocktail Party, and The Confidential Clerk. He also had a very interesting collection of Owl Possum's Book of Practical Cats, and his most important poetic work continues to be The Wasteland, which was published in 4 different parts. And also he wrote a series of essays on poetry and criticism and published it under the title The Sacred Wood. This continues to be one of the foundational works in terms of modern literary criticism. He was also the assistant editor of the journal The Egoist, which was published in the early 20th century. In this context, let me also draw your attention to Eliot's letter to Wyndham Lewis, who was also a leading poet and painter of those times. In fact, Wyndham Lewis is the one who made the portrait of Eliot, which was also quite acceptable to Eliot himself and also to posterity. In Eliot's letter, he wrote, "It seems to be a very good portrait and one by which I am quite willing that posterity should know me if it takes any interest in me at all. And I certainly have no desire now that my portrait should be painted by any painter whose portrait of me would be accepted by the Royal Academy." And we also find him moving away from the tenets of art which were set by the Royal Academy and going ahead to endorse an artist who was not really appreciated by the Royal Academy. The other popular modernist poets of those times were Robert Bridges and John Masefield, and they were also incidentally the best-selling poets of the 1920s. And both these poets, Bridges and Masefield, they were both poet laureates. Bridges was a poet laureate from 1913 till 1930 and Masefield from 1930 till 1967. This perhaps is also the most opportune time to take a look at the other remaining poet laureates in England. Cecil Day Lewis became the poet laureate in 68 and continued till 72. Sir John Betterman from 72 till 84. Ted Hughes from 1984 to 98, and Andrew Motion from 1999 till 2009. The present Poet Laureate of England is Carol Ann Duffy, who was appointed to the post in 2009. The important poets of the 1930s modernism include Hugh Davis, Hugh MacDiarmid, W.H. Auden, Stephen Spender, and John Betjeman. Kathleen Raine, Welsh Dylan Thomas, George Barker were also important figures of those times. And David Gascoigne's name we find in multiple contexts because he was writing from the early modernist time onwards. There was also a set of poets known as the movement poets who wrote from 1930 till 1945. They celebrated a sense of the anarchic and also believed that a violent kind of poetry was needed for this violent age. And they also popularized a poetry of terror and extremity, and some also considered their work as being highly immoral. Some of the important poets whose names are associated with the movement poets include Philip Larkin, Kingsley Amis, Donald Davy, Elizabeth Jennings, Herbert Reed Barker, Dylan Thomas and Gascoigne. And most of these writers were primarily English in character. We do not find any writers of other origins being associated with this movement. And it's generally said that the decline of the movement poets began with the publication of the New Lines anthology, and this also led to many of the others dissociating with this movement. In fact, it was through this decline that a new movement was launched in 1956 named the Angry Young Men, and this became more popular during the turning point of the movement, and the writers, mostly dramatists associated with the Angry Young Men movement include John Osborne, Harold Pinter, Philip Larkin, John Wayne and Kingsley Amis. So by now we have noticed that there is a wide range of writers and wide range of influences that we talk about when we talk about modernist poetry. It's very difficult to identify a singular strand in which one can bring in a group of people, or one can begin to talk about modernist poetry in a linear phase. It's multifaceted, it's a complex, and it's also quite inherently complicated. So with this understanding, we try to wrap up today's discussion on modernist poetry. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to seeing you in the next session.